Hello, everybody. Patricia Calkins here again. I'd like to talk to you just a little bit more about the process of immigration and acculturation. We had already learned about how the fact that an immigrant who comes into another culture goes through a period of adaptation that is called acculturation. We need to remember that it's a challenge to move from one culture to another. When we get into a new culture, we are exposed to so many things that we have never seen before, or heard before, or believed before. There are new values, there are new beliefs, there are new behaviors that are expected of us, and we are also changed because of our exposure to them. It could be that beliefs that we had held dear before are no longer valued or are not taken for granted. If we had built our ideas of ourselves based on some of those beliefs, and those beliefs are no longer um, ubiquitous in the culture, then that shakes us to the core. Who we are could be questioned. What was important to us may not be important anymore, and there may be changes in status as well. These changes can either be seen as positive or they can be seen as negative. There are several things that influence whether we're going to see these changes caused by acculturation as positive or as negative. So some factor that may make us to see these as either positive or more negative are how similar and dissimilar the two cultures are. If the cultures are more similar, then things will probably be seen as more positive rather than as something negative. There's also the question of whether the contact between my home culture and this new culture is voluntary or not. So if I have chosen to emigrate to a new country, as opposed to arriving in this new country as a refugee, that's going to change how I feel about the differences in our cultures. And there's also the question of whether the contact is going to be permanent. So if I am a refugee and do not believe that I will ever be able to return to my home culture, I'm going to feel differently about it than an international student who knows that at the time that he or she finishes a degree, that they will be able to return home. Also, when we're thinking about immigration, we need to think about what that person's migration experience was like. Did they simply get on a plane and arrive in the United States, or did they flee at the risk of losing their life? So that could also help us uh, decide that something was more positive or more negative. And then there is also the question of a status difference. Many immigrants who come to the United States have a lower status than they had in their country of origin. And if it seems like life is much less pleasing here in the new country, then they would be more likely to see something as negative. Finally, there may be changes in the family structure. So, for example, it might be that you would leave siblings behind at your home culture, or a child may be left there, or there may be a parent left at home. We know that people leave their family and friend networks in their home culture, and this can also affect then how you adapt to the new culture. John Barry was a sociologist who came up with a two-dimensional model of acculturation. It's based on two questions. How much does a person want to maintain the original culture? And how much does a person want to adapt to the new culture? And the interaction of these two different um, views of the home culture and the new culture uh, often will affect the kind of strategy that a person uses to acculturate. And you can see that there are four different acculturation versions in this model. One is integration, another is assimilation, then we have separation and marginalization. So let's look and see what those mean. In assimilation, people consider their culture of origin to be not important. They want to identify and interact with a new culture. So they step aside from their old culture and are very quick to take on qualities of the new culture. For separation, that's when people who value their heritage culture don't want to learn about the new culture and feel better if they continue with their old culture within the new culture. So these people are adopting a separation strategy. This often happens if there is a difference in um, important social factors, such as religion, may be a factor why you would determine that you would separate. An example of separation in US culture is the Amish, who have their own culture within US culture and yet separate from US culture. Marginalization occurs when people neither identify with their heritage culture nor with their new culture. They don't belong in either place, and in fact, they belong nowhere. Marginalization is especially difficult for immigrants. Finally, there's integration. With integration, people seek to maintain their heritage culture, but they want to learn from and interact with a new culture. So they try to take pieces of their heritage culture and make them part of their lives within the new culture. So they have a bicultural strategy. Research with emotional and mental health professionals shows that if people choose or are forced to take a strategy of marginalization, this tends to be harder on them than some other strategies. They become more depressed and anxious and have poorer mental health of any of the other groups. Those who use integration are the most psychologically healthy of all of the groups. And those who use a separation strategy or an assimilation strategy lie somewhere in between. This doesn't mean that for the integration folks, there is no stress. There is always going to be stress. But if you are able to pursue an integration strategy, you are likely to be less stressed and more successful. Often there is family or group conflict over acculturation. So, acculturation strategies are generally chosen by an individual. So, an individual adjusts to a new culture. If an individual is part of a group, then each individual in that group may have a different strategy, and the rate of acculturation may not be the same. This can cause conflict. So grandparents may pursue a strategy of separation. They're older, they were in the heritage culture longer. It may be harder for them to learn a language, and it may be harder for them to find employment outside of the household. So separation may work best for them. The father in the family may choose marginalization and have no real feeling for either of the cultures. The mother may choose integration, and the children may be more attracted to the new culture and thus choose assimilation. So that can cause a lot of intergenerational family conflict. There might also be one person who has different acculturation strategies depending on the parts of their lives. So there may be an acculturation strategy at work, which is integration. So I want to be fully involved with my coworkers and the culture at work, but in private life, I prefer to be separate. All of these permutations can cause stress within the group, which makes acculturation even more stressful. Sometimes the form of acculturation that somebody takes is voluntarily chosen, and sometimes the form that is taken is forced upon the new immigrant. Barry had four preconditions that would determine the likelihood of which strategy might be pursued. The first is the level of acceptance by a society for the value of cultural diversity. If the society I am integrating into does not value cultural diversity, it will be harder for me to integrate into it. There also may be a level of prejudice. There may be attitudes among ethnocultural groups, my own ethnocultural group, other ethnocultural groups that are part of that society, that may affect the form of acculturation. And the extent of my identification with the larger society by individuals and by groups. So, what kind of identification do I have with the dominant culture? All of those things are going to affect the way that I acculturate.